All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning, good morning to you. Good morning, good morning. Won't you share with a friend or two? Good morning. Good morning to you. Good morning. Good morning to you. And many more. And many more. Good morning, everyone, and welcome, welcome, welcome to Daring Dialogues. I am your host today, Shantae Charles. I want to thank you for your time and for your attention in joining me this morning. Let's go ahead and make sure that we have our settings correctly in place. All right, and let's get down to the business. This is another This is another bonus episode for season 14. Again, we finished up our 100 episodes on Monday. So we are finishing out Black History Month, and I'm going to continue to share with you what I am learning in the hopes that it will encourage, inspire you, and hopefully you're learning something that you didn't know before. I'm reading today from two books. I'm going to start with Many Thousand Gone, African Americans from Slavery to Freedom. And this section is called Some Conductors on the Underground Railroad. It was known that Nat Turner had been a preacher and that he could read and write. After his rebellion, the enslaved were forbidden reading material. After his rebellion, enslaved people were forbidden reading material. So, yes, one of the things that I do and that I love to do in this platform is I love to read aloud. Why? Because it was literally illegal to do so. It was dangerous to do so. You could be harmed for doing what I'm doing right now. And so I don't ever take it for granted to be able to get on a platform and publicly read aloud. So, yes, reading is a form of resistance. After his rebellion, enslaved people were forbidden reading material. The black codes were imposed more harshly. Free blacks could not enter the states of Tennessee and Virginia. Black seamen were imprisoned in South Carolina while their ships were in port. It was against the law in North Carolina, Mississippi, and Virginia to distribute anti slavery literature. So you could not spread and publish literature that went against enslaving people. Hello, anti DEI. Increasingly, the only way out for enslaved people was to run away, even though it meant risking their lives. There were helpers all along the route north if only the fugitives could find them. Runaways quickly learned that the most trustworthy people in the North were free black conductors on the railroad. And good morning to each of you coming in. One such man was John Malvin, a conductor who worked a limited route from one northern station to the next. He owned a canal boat that ran from Cleveland to Marietta, Ohio, a route that took him close to the Ohio River. His boat carried fugitives. Another conductor was Leonard Andrew Grimes, the owner of a horse and carriage business in Washington, D.C. Using his buggies, Grimes often rescued fugitives. On one rescue, he was captured trying to carry away a slave family. and then he spent 2 years in prison for it. Afterward, he went to Boston where he became the minister of the Fugitive Slave Church. Because, yes, not all churches were started under the quote unquote slave master's doctrines. The 12th Baptist Church of Boston. Later, he was involved in one of the most celebrated escaped slave cases in American history, that of Anthony Burns. There were hundreds of black conductors in Ohio alone. Because Ohio was just across the river from the enslaved states of Kentucky and Virginia, it had the most active and numerous underground railroad routes. Shout out to Ohio. Jane Lewis was a conductor on the Ohio Underground. From New Lebanon, Ohio, she found her way to the Ohio River and rode runaways from the far side to the Ohio Freedom Shore. Another conductor was Elijah Anderson, known as the General Superintendent of the Northwestern Ohio Underground. He sent 1,000 enslaved people along the railroad before he was caught and sent to prison in Kentucky, where he died. Fugitives from southern states would risk their lives becoming conductors and going back into the South, as did Cy Henson, to find their families and other enslaved persons who were willing to run away. John Mason, a Kentucky runaway, had reached Canada. He became a conductor, going back to his home state and convincing friends to follow him north. After assisting 265 enslaved persons to Canada, he was captured and sold back into enslavement. But Mason managed to escape again. It is said that he helped more than 1,000 fugitives along the Underground Railroad. Two more black men, William Still and Robert Purvis, were famous abolitionists from Philadelphia, and we've read part of William Still's writings in the other book. Still wrote down the story of every fugitive who passed through his lines. While interviewing a runaway from the South in 1850, Still discovered that the fugitive was his own long lost brother. Over their lifetimes, Still and Purvis helped some 9,000 fugitives along the Underground Railroad up through Pennsylvania to freedom. Now, some people call them fugitives. Most of the museums that I have been to lately have been calling them freedom seekers. So this is an older book, but the new term that people are using is freedom seekers. There were white conductors who harbored fugitives also. Some became famous as fierce abolitionist leaders: John Rankin, Levi Coffin, Thomas Garrett, and Elijah Lovejoy, to name a few. They lived across the river from slave states. They had no time for arguing the rights of their cause. They believed in using force if they had to. Those are the kind of people that we need in 2025. And as I'm going to keep on saying, if you're not on John Brown energy, if you're not on rescuing people energy, stay out of black folks' comment sections. If you come in my comment sections, it's an automatic block. That's just what it is. I'm not arguing with people. I'm not going back and forth. I'm not going to be talking about who's deserving and who's not deserving. No, you are either for human rights or you are a part of the dehumanizing brigade. So when I see that you're part of the dehumanizing brigade, because you think for whatever reason it's okay to dehumanize people, it's an automatic block out of my spaces. Because we just don't have time. We don't have time to argue with people about our humanhood, our personhood. We don't have time for that. So if you come to my social media spaces with the foolishness, it's an automatic block. I'm not going to try to convince you. I'm not going to go back and forth with you. I'm not going to try to, argue with you about who deserves human rights and who doesn't. Clearly, we are on different pages. And so, why are you here? Block. Eliza. There's a runaway enslaved person called Eliza who escaped from Kentucky over ice floes in the Ohio River in Harriet Beecher Stowe's uncle, in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Miss Stowe said her book was a collection and arrangement of real incidences. So it was based on the incidences of real people. And that the chase across the ice floes was drawn from an actual rescue involving her husband, Calvin Ellis Stowe, a clergyman, and her brother, Henry Ward Beecher. The real life Eliza escaped from Kentucky with her baby in her arms. When she came to the Ohio River, she saw large chunks of ice floating on it, but that didn't stop her, for the enslaved hunters were in hot pursuit. She leapt from one ice floe to the next in an agonizing act of courage until she reached the Freedom Shore. And I really love this illustration of the mother leaping from ice chunk to ice chunk to get to freedom. Eliza was rescued by the family of the Reverend John Rankin and stayed in their house above the river. Levi Coffin then aided her on the difficult journey to Canada. As Eliza left the Rankin Underground Station, she told John Rankin that she would come back for her other children who were still enslaved in Kentucky in June of the following year. Reverend Rankin doubted that he would ever see her again, but a year later in June, a man came climbing up to the garden of the Rankin house. It was Eliza wearing men's clothing, ready to get her children and bring them out. The Rankins helped her back across the Ohio River into Kentucky. Because it was Sunday, the plantation owner and his wife were away visiting. Eliza hastened to carry off her 5 children and 200 pounds of household goods. The heavy load slowed them down. By the time they reached the river again, the sun was up and fog on the water was lifting. The Rankins waited for Eliza on the Ohio side, their guns at the ready. They saw dogs and men on horseback spread out on the Kentucky shore. One Rankin son, dressed as a slave woman, slipped across the river. He quickly attracted the slave hunters' attention and led them on a wild goose chase away from where Eliza and her children were hidden. For hours, the posse chased the disguised Rankin son. Finally, darkness fell and the hunters lost him. A Rankin helper had by then guided Eliza, her family, and all their belongings back across the river to the safe house on the Ohio bluff. 2 weeks later, Eliza and her children were conducted along the Underground Railroad line to Canada. Shout out to Eliza, the mother who went back for her children. Isabella, we know her as Sojourner. Isabella Baumfree became famous in her lifetime as Sojourner Truth, an abolitionist, lecturer, preacher, and self-styled prophet. She was born in Ulster County, New York, in 1797, the enslaved person of a Dutch owner. In all of her life, she would speak with a Dutch accent. Isabella was sold several times. Her owner refused to free her when all enslaved persons in New York were freed by the state's Emancipation Act of 1827. Some accounts say she ran away the year before because of beatings by her owner. In any case, she did run to New York City with one of her many children and there found work as a maid. Isabella never learned to read or write English, but that didn't stop her from learning or trying to find a deeper meaning to her life. When she was 46, she felt an urgent desire to come to the aid of her people. I felt so tall within, she said. I felt the power of the nation was with me. It was spring. Deep inside her, Isabella felt she had gone through being born a second time. She knew she must speak out against slavery, and she prepared herself to do just that. This is her words. I went to the Lord and asked him to give me a new name. And the Lord gave me Sojourner because I was to travel up and down the land, showing the people their sins and being a sign unto them. Afterward, I told the Lord I wanted another name because everybody else had 2 names. And the Lord gave me Truth because I was to declare the truth to the people. Now, as she became Sojourner Truth, Isabella felt complete. 6 feet tall, thin, and with a dark complexion, and very erect, Sojourner Truth set out walking to gather in my flock. Through the East, Massachusetts, Connecticut, through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, through Kansas she went, preaching freedom for her people. She became the most famous and perhaps the best anti slavery speaker of her time. Wherever she went, a large crowd gathered to hear her. At first, people were simply curious about this strange black woman, but soon they grew to admire her passion. They thought she had the gift of prophecy. She certainly had a gift for putting words together in a dramatic fashion. Once she stood up at a meeting to answer someone who had praised the Constitution of the United States. She had the habit of calling everybody children, and so she began. Children, I talk to God and God talks to me. I go and talk to God in the fields and woods. This morning I was walking out and I got over the fence. I saw the wheat a holding up its head, looking very big. I go up and take hold of it. You believe it? There was no wheat there. I said, God, what is the matter with this wheat? And he said to me, Sojourner, there is a little weevil in it. Now I hear talk about the Constitution and the rights of man. I come up and I take hold of this Constitution. It looks mighty big and I feel for my rights, but there ain't any there. Then I say, God, what ails this Constitution? He says to me, Sojourner, there is a little weevil in it. Mm, mm, mm. Not only did Sojourner Truth address meetings for the abolitionist cause, she also spoke out for the rights of women. She said, I've been looking around and watching things, and I know a little mite about women's rights too. I know that it feels kind of hissing and tickling, like to see a colored woman up yet again, but we have been long enough trodden down now. We will come up again. And now I am here, sitting among you to watch. Every once in a while I will come out, tell you what time of night it is. At one convention, Sojourner argued against men who thought women needed to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. They thought too that women had lower intelligence than men and should not vote. So if you're just coming in, I am not rude. I am doing what I normally do on this program, which is read aloud. When you enter in on time, I greet everybody. All right? I am doing well. I do pay attention to the chat. Please do not put things in my chat that is not characteristic of who I am. All right, let's continue reading. At one convention, Sojourner argued against men who thought women needed to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. They thought too that women had lower intelligence than men and should not vote. And unfortunately, we have people in 2025 that have that same kind of attitude. All right, so we're helping people find their way. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles. And ain't I a woman, she said. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen them most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? She had a deep voice, like a man's, some said. She was proud in her bearing. Intelligence fairly leaped out of her bright eyes. Sojourner worked just enough to keep herself going. She slept wherever she could find a place to lie down. There were many attempts to stop her from standing up to lecture at public meetings, but nothing, it seemed, could keep Sojourner down, although she was beaten and even stoned on occasions. She began wearing a banner across her chest that said, Proclaim liberty through the land unto all the inhabitants thereof, was written across this banner. Some people felt threatened by Sojourner's power over crowds. They said there had to be something wrong with her, that maybe she wasn't a female at all. Prove you are a woman, a man demanded once while Sojourner was speaking. Sojourner ripped her blouse open to the waist. Shocked, people turned their eyes away. But it was the heckler's shame, she said, not hers, that she must so prove herself. When she was old, Sojourner gave up traveling and lecturing. She had taught freed women in Washington, D.C., and crusaded for black settlements on Western public lands. And though she was not a part of the Underground Railroad system, she inspired many to travel the secret rails. She lived close by her daughters in Battle Creek, Michigan, and died there at the age of 85 on November 26, 1883. The Sojourner Truth grave is at Oak Hill Cemetery in Battle Creek, Michigan. If you're in Michigan, you should go check it out and pay some honor and respect to Sojourner Truth. All right, I'm going to stop here in this book because I want to get to the second book and an important conversation about media and movement. This book is entitled I Can't Wait to Call You My Wife, African American Letters of Love and Family in the Civil War Era. I'm not reading letters from here today because I want to focus in on some of the external text that's talking about media and movement. I think it's important to look at some of the challenges that Black media has had in the past, um, as we're seeing and having some conversations now with journalists being removed from legacy media. Um, a lot of the conversation right now is building our own. And of course, we're all for that. Build our own networks. But as someone also pointed out, the government does have a hand in who gets licensing, who gets media and network licensing. So until we don't have a government that's literally working against the betterment and wellness of Black people, using a platform like YouTube is helpful. Um, and the journalists that are out there that have been displaced, we've been talking about on my channel about those journalists getting together and creating roundtables and using platforms like YouTube and doing nightly news reports. Why? Because Black people still need information from people qualified to give it to us, from people who have trained in the field of investigative journalism. So I'm encouraging, and I know other people are encouraging, for those journalists to get together, put together your own roundtable. Black people will support you. We will come and watch. A lot of us are snatching our viewership from these legacy media channels that are anti-Black, anti-diversity, anti-equity, anti-inclusion, and that viewership can be transferred to a new site with people who actually care about us, yeah, and honor us as fellow human beings. So let's take a look at what the researcher here is telling us about media. Black newspapers, beginning with the New York City Freedom's Journal in 1827, struggled financially because most African Americans lacked the means to help keep a newspaper solvent. So we know that it was an economic barrier to media. Right now, we've got political barriers, we've got legislative barriers sometimes. We've got people who are under pressure from our government to get rid of Black, Indigenous persons of color in media. The North Star, Frederick Douglass's weekly newspaper printed in Rochester, New York, began publication in December 1847 and lasted longer than other Black newspapers due to significant financial help from white abolitionists in the US and Britain. So even Frederick Douglass, with his name, with him being, utilizing media during that time, he was one of the most photographed people in the country during that time. He still needed help. Okay. And who did he get help from? He got help from white abolitionists, people who were on the side of rights, people who were on the side of humanity. Again, those are the people that we want to build coalitions with, people who are on the side of humanity. So when someone asks me, well, what's your plumb line? What is your baseline for coalition building? My baseline for coalition building is, are you for the rights of human beings or not? Or are you only for the rights of certain human beings? That is going to make a difference as to whether or not you're going to build coalition with people. If you're not for the rights of humans and you only say these people deserve rights, everybody else can suffer, we can't build a coalition. It's that simple. In 1851, Douglass changed the name from the North Star to the Frederick Douglass Paper, and then in 1858 to Douglass Monthly. Douglass viewed his papers as the voice of African America, and most black activists apparently agreed. Activists' conviction that they needed their own newspaper was confirmed time and again as anti black and pro slavery propaganda monopolized much of the American press. This was in 1858. Here we are in 2025. What has changed? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. Anti black and pro enslavement propaganda is still monopolizing much of the American press. In 1859, black activist and New York journalist Thomas Hamilton published a monthly magazine, the Anglo African Magazine, that focused on black literature and social criticism. Hamilton's list of contributors included Dr. James McCune Smith, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Mary Ann Shadd Cary, and Frederick Douglass, with topics ranging from McCune's analysis of race ideology to Harper's poetry. Around the same time, Hamilton published the weekly Anglo African newspaper, which, with the help of his brother, teacher Robert Hamilton, and funding from James McCune Smith, lasted until a few months after the end of the Civil War. Unfortunately, because Hamilton could not get sufficient financial support, this truly remarkable publishing achievement folded after little more than a year. So, if we're going to encourage people to go into black media, if we're going to encourage people to start channels, if we're going to encourage people to put out publications, then that means we have to make a commitment to financial support if we want to see it continue and we want to see it grow. As they protested against local, state, and federal government's inequities, hello, 2025, African American activists established black institutions such as churches. Yes, churches are black institutions. Schools, male and female literary societies, fraternal organizations, and other social organizations. These were the institutions that they started establishing. Women were especially active in raising funds to support the schools and churches, and several were critical to establishing and teaching at black schools. Hello, teachers. Teachers arise. The Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia had a strong academic curriculum that included mathematics, natural philosophy, Latin, Greek, higher algebra, trigonometry, natural sciences, and rhetoric. Grace Douglass, who is no relation to Frederick Douglass, headed the female department, and her daughter, Sarah Mapps Douglass, headed the elementary school. In 1852, Sarah Mapps Douglass would become the first African American woman to attend the Female Medical College of Pennsylvania. African Americans not only established their own schools in the larger cities, such as Philly, but in the early 19th century, they also created two distinct Protestant denominations. So, yes, we were creating our own institutions happily. African Methodist Episcopal Church and African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Most of all, black activists, men and women, concentrated on the abolition of slavery in the years leading up to the Civil War. Abolition was the first step toward a stable and permanent place for individuals, families, and communities in American society. A minority of black and white individuals formed anti-slavery societies that petitioned individual northern states and the federal government to end slavery. Yet anyone looking at the small group of black and white abolitionists who were gathering to form these national organizations would have predicted failure. The response to the idea of immediately abolishing slavery The idea that Southerners must immediately begin the abolition process was swift and hostile from most quarters of the country. The slaveholding South placed bounties on the heads of abolitionists who dared speak against slavery. And you think they not placing bounties now? Black abolitionist David Walker became the target of pro slavery supporters when his 1829 pamphlet, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, was disseminated throughout the country. By the 1850s, however, the abolitionist movement had spread throughout the North through speeches, through enslaved narratives, i.e., people getting up and telling their story of the horrific nature of slavery, through petitions and evangelical style recruiting efforts. Abolitionists convinced many Northerners that slavery was immoral and had no place in the free republic. Somebody asked the question the other day on my page. They asked the question, why are preachers getting involved in politics? Why are these black preachers getting involved in politics? If you're asking that question, then you don't understand that we've always been involved, that racism, that enslavement was a political issue and an economic issue. So the black prophetic has always been activated because it is a part of freedom. We've always been involved. I don't know why some people don't understand that, but we've always been involved. In this endeavor, fugitive slaves were critical. Frederick Douglass and Jermaine Logan, who we learned about earlier, were just two of several, mostly men, often accompanied by white abolitionists. They traveled the lecture circuit hoping to persuade white Northerners to join the movement. Black women abolitionists formed their own abolitionist societies, or they joined white female anti slavery societies. Some, like the former New York slave who named herself Sojourner Truth, which we talked about, were part of the lecture circuit. Whether male or female, black or white, abolitionists were regularly shouted down, ridiculed, and derided. It was not an easy work. They weren't social media influencers, and that's not an easy work. But there certainly was not an easy work. Men not only suffered derision, but were also beaten by white mobs, especially in the early years of the movement. William Lloyd Garrison, the passionate and influential anti slavery editor of the Liberator newspaper, was often attacked. He and other white abolitionist newspaper editors published many black lectures and letters and other anti slavery information. Abolitionists not only recruited white Northerners to their cause, but also organized boycotts of products. Because, yes, the boycott is a black tradition too. They boycotted cotton, depending upon the labor of the enslaved people. Now, cotton was king, so to boycott cotton was essentially like boycotting Walmart, Amazon. Equally as important, many abolitionists were deeply involved in the Underground Railroad that helped transport thousands of fugitive enslaved persons to the North or to Canada through vigilance committees. The railroad, a series of interlocking local networks operating throughout the North and Upper South, could not have functioned without the aid of local blacks, both enslaved and free. Black abolitionist William Still, the operator of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society's Philadelphia Vigilance Committee, good grief, we know how to name things long. That's a black tradition too. Was a key agent who, with his wife Letitia, sometimes hid fugitives in their home. Still's record of individuals who escaped through Philadelphia provides an invaluable resource for understanding the multiple means that fugitives used to escape enslavement. His record helps us to understand. During the 2 decades before the war, they often took advantage of newer means of transportation and stowed away on coastal vessels or found ship captains willing to transport them for a price. Aiding fugitives directly was only part of the Underground Railroad activities. Still, and other agents, black and white, were constantly raising funds to support their operations and to buy enslaved people out of slavery, a controversial strategy among some abolitionists. Because guess what? Even back then, everybody didn't agree with how people were going to get free. But guess what? If you were on the side of freedom, you might have had those disagreements, but you didn't let it stop the overall goal and the purpose, which was freeing people. Abolitionists, here's what they all agreed on. Abolitionists all agreed that slavery should be abolished immediately, but they disagreed on some of the means to attain their goal. For example, Bostonian William Lloyd Garrison and his followers were opposed to abolitionists participating in America's political system at all. Oh, you mean that's still an argument today? You mean that's still an argument today? That some abolitionists said don't participate in the system at all? The government, after all, supported and protected slavery. Others argued that abolitionists needed to place anti slavery politicians in local, in state, and especially the federal government. Abolitionists also disagreed on whether enslaved people should be purchased out of enslavement. Opponents of this approach argued that the purchase only reinforced the immoral argument that humans could be owned as property in the first place. Others believed that even though the numbers were incredibly small, purchasing people out of enslavement would weaken the system. Okay? So everybody didn't agree on everything, but they all agreed that it should end. So even as you are working to coalition build with people, find where your similarities are and work them. And don't get caught up in arguments. And certainly don't get caught up in distractions. With the help of the abolitionists and philanthropists, many fugitives settled near the Canadian border. The Canadian government had officially granted asylum to fugitives in the early 19th century, and it consistently rejected demands to extradite them back. Fugitives became free when they arrived on Canadian soil and, depending upon the region, found less racism in law and custom than in the northern states. Free northern blacks joined them, settling mostly in parts of the Ontario province and some in the city of Montreal. Black Canadians from the United States brought a diverse set of skills and included farmers, domestics, cooks, carpenters, dressmakers, and waiters. Many had been hired out, enslaved persons. And I'm going to stop there for today. Let's see, where's my bookmark? I hate to bend this page. I don't want to bend the page. All right, I'll figure it out. Let me just leave it open for now. All right, this has been my reading for today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something new. I hope it's got you thinking about how pre-Civil War attitudes and behaviors are now being seen again here in the United States. I hope you got some insight into how we can combat it. If you are a person who is working on the side of being pro-human rights, I hope you will build some coalitions, join some coalitions, and don't let your differences be the distraction. That's my takeaway today. Don't let your differences be the distraction. Find the common grounds, work the common grounds. As long as you know that people are for the rights of humanity, be willing to build coalition with them. And yeah, that's all I want to say today. I want to thank you for your time and attention by YouTube. We're going to go over to Instagram at Daring Dialogues, is the handle, and we're going to have the talk back there. Until tomorrow, which will be our last show of the season, I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness, so continue to go out and be light. Want to chat with me personally? Got a message for me? Email me at thedaringdialogues@gmail.com. All right. Take care, be well, and most importantly, be light. All right.